On behalf of the Stanton Distinguished Leader Series and the Georgetown Program in Business and Global Affairs, I would like to welcome you tonight. My name is Brad Jensen. I'm a professor here in the business school and also currently serve as the academic director of our new joint program between the business school and the School of Foreign Service, the new Bachelor of Science in Business and Global Affairs degree program. So just as some context for our conversation tonight, whether it's the trade war, the ongoing saga with Huawei, Brexit, Iran sanctions, if you look at the news, one cannot escape the importance of the interaction between business and global affairs. Right? Georgetown has long recognized the importance of this complex interaction between commercial activity and international affairs, and has a long history of successful programs at the nexus of business and international affairs, both at the master's level and at the undergraduate level. In this new joint undergraduate degree program is the newest and possibly the most ambitious program to date. The Bachelor of Science in Business and Global Affairs has a number of innovative features, the most notable of which are a sequence of major courses that are co-developed and co-delivered by MSB and SFS faculty, and an emphasis on experiential learning. The first course in the major, which we are in the midst of offering the inaugural class of right now, focuses on how global markets and politics interact, how institutions shape the interaction between actors and interests in an economy to deliver policy outcomes. The second course in the major, which will be offered for the first time next year, focuses on a broader set of institutions, what you could think of as culture, right? And how these influence how we work together in teams and how they affect our leadership. So given the focus of these initial courses, on how business, culture, and policy interact, I can say that I am excited and we are excited and delighted and very thankful to have with us this evening Mark Dunkerley to share some of his experience and insights into these issues. Mark today serves as a member of the board of directors of Spirit Airlines in the United States and Volotea Airlines in Europe. He is also the vice chairman of the Smithsonian National Air and Space Museum. Until just recently, Mark was the president and CEO of Hawaiian Airlines and its parent company, Hawaiian Holdings, as well as a member of the board of both. During Mark's 15-year tenure leading the company, Hawaiian Airlines became the industry's foremost airline for operational performance, delivered the highest levels of customer service, and was among the most financially successful carriers globally. And I will note, and I won't call out our TA for this course, who is a native of Hawaii, but who, in unprompted and glowing terms, said what a great airline Hawaiian Airlines is, and endorsed all of what I just said as being absolutely true. Prior to Hawaiian, Mark was the chief operating officer at Sabina Airlines. He's held other senior leadership positions in a number of other airline companies, including British Airways. Mark is an alumnus of Cranfield University and the London School of Economics. We are also delighted to have with us tonight our own Professor Pietro Rivoli here to lead the conversation with Mark. Pietro is a professor in economics and international business here at the McDonough School of Business, in addition to a number of articles in leading academic journals. Professor Rivoli's book, The Travels of a T-Shirt in the Global Economy, which is currently in its third edition, has been widely acclaimed by both the popular press and the academic community as a path-breaking and painstaking, I'm sure, study of globalization. The book has received numerous awards, including Best Business Book Award of the Financial Times, Booz Allen Hamilton, Foreign Affairs, and a number of others, and has been translated into 14 languages. So Pietro and Mark will have a conversation for about half an hour or so, and then we will open it up to questions. So without further ado, welcome.
Thank you so much, Brad. So very much looking forward to this conversation with you, Mark. Brad and I have had a chance to talk with Mark before. Fascinating career, many insights to share. So, Mark, you've spent 30 years in the same industry, the airline industries, and that's a little bit unusual nowadays. But my first question is how it all started. Was it your plan, or was it an accident?
It was largely an accident. I come from a family, as it turns out, of academics. The assumption was that I was going to follow in their footsteps. And as I was going through graduate school, I decided that I actually wanted to go in a different direction. And I reached that sort of horrible moment where it dawned on me that I was actually going to have to work for a living. And as I sort of processed that reality, I thought about the things that I enjoyed doing and the things that I wanted to do. And for me, the opportunity to travel and to work and experience cultures separate from my own was very high on the list. And so the airline industry sort of appealed. I arrived at the airline industry that way. Once you're in it, it's a fascinating business. It's a very difficult business. It's a very competitive business. For most of the time that I was in the industry, it was a perennially loss-making disaster of a business. But it was fascinating. Once you're in, you kind of end up staying there.
So we have a lot of undergraduate students today. They're out there kind of considering their futures too. Are there certain kinds of people or that you would say don't go into the airline industry and certain that you think it's perfect for?
Well, again, for most of my career, I would have said to each and every one of them, don't go in the airline industry. It's as I say, it's a business which is naturally unstable. It's a business in which you have very high average costs and very low marginal costs. And that creates a dynamic where there is always the marginal producer in a market looking to capture that last seat sale and bringing prices down. And so we are a business which has traditionally had very slender margins. It is therefore not a business for somebody whose primary focus is, I think, a level of stability in their lives. It is not a business which has traditionally been extremely profitable. It is a very dynamic, it's a very interesting business, and it is a business in which there's a lot going on sort of all the time. You have a strategic outlook that is constantly being attacked, undermined, changed by short-term considerations and externalities that come into play, and you're constantly working, massaging those two at the same time. And that's kind of different from many other businesses. So that may appeal, it may not.
So in the current class in Business and Global Affairs that we're teaching right now, we're talking about the intersection of business and international affairs, mostly from the policy perspective. So how rules get made, how companies navigate those rules, possibly try to influence them. A couple of recent things we've talked about are U.S. companies pushing for policies to allow them into China in various industries, and tech companies such as Amazon, their push into India. And in those cases, we've been talking about, the rules. So how companies try to navigate these rules to do these market expansions. But your experience says to us that there's a whole nother layer of things besides the rules that you have to consider as you expand internationally. This component of culture that's not written down, but every bit as important. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I absolutely. The example I always give to people in sort of setting up a discussion of this very thing is that if you are familiar with Maslow's hierarchy of needs, you know that right at the top of the sort of pyramid of it all is shelter. And you might reasonably presume that societies, a similar level of income, similar level of industrialization, therefore might transact the business of providing shelter, buying, selling homes, rent, and so on, in the same way. In fact, nothing could be further from the truth. The process for buying a home in the United States is very different from the UK, very different from Australia, very different from Japan. And so even at the most basic need that we all share, which is to provide for ourselves some shelter, there are cultural differences, societal differences on how you go about transacting that business. The reason I start with that as an example is because one of the common failures, particularly of American companies, is a failure to appreciate that the way in which people choose to buy goods and services overseas is different from the way in which they choose to buy those same goods and services at home. I say particularly American companies because this is the largest consumer market in the world. And so in US organizations, when you look and say, hey, we want to move into, for example, Australia, there is a natural presumption of two things. One is, they're English speaking, they're sort of like us, and ergo, we don't have to change our model of selling our good or service in that market, number one. Number two, even if we were cognizant of it, it would require us breaking the ethos of the company, and we're not going to do that to tailor to a small market when it is far more important in commercial terms to take care of our home market. But if you're going to succeed overseas, you have got to approach the marketplace on terms and with sensitivity for the consumer at that end. And I use Australia as an example. In this country, the distribution, the marketing of air travel, the way in which people buy air travel is really well known. All of you hopefully got away over the holiday break. You probably climbed on an airplane, and the chances are you went online and bought the travel portion of your break, independent from whatever else you did, and you did it online. In Australia, that doesn't happen very much. It doesn't happen very much because distances are greater in Australia, holidays tend to be longer, and people actually are buying more than just round-trip air tickets. They're on an itinerary that might take them from Australia around Europe with multiple stops and eventually back home. They are interested in hotels, in trains. The air portion of it is only one portion of what they're actually buying. And as a consequence, by far the largest channel of distribution for air travel in Australia is bricks and mortar travel agents. Very different from here. Very similar culture, ostensibly. Similar level of income per capita, English speaking, similar legal systems, similar everything, but very different way of approaching the sales process.
So you've described two countries with a lot of overlap in their culture, but I know you've also had experience trying to do the same thing in countries with very different cultures. Maybe you could share a couple of those highlight experiences.
Yeah, well, Hawaiian Airlines is an airline which over the last 15 years we expanded pretty aggressively into Asia. So we went from being effectively a domestic airline into being a largely international airline. We flew to 9, 10 different countries around Asia, many of them very different from the United States, Japan, Korea, China, for example. We were successful in some countries and we were not successful in others. The successful companies include Japan, which is actually quite a difficult market for a non-Japanese company to succeed in. So strong are the sort of cultural draws in Japan to products that they know and understand and whose quality is of a level that people feel comfortable with. In that case, it was about, in the first instance, building relationships across the spectrum of suppliers and governments and other agencies. And you don't do that by going and visiting them once, going out for a nice dinner, and then sending them a nice email later. That does not meet the threshold of sincerity that society looks to. So in the case of Hawaiian Airlines, in the year before we started our one flight a day, I went up to Tokyo 10 times in that year, almost once a month. I was the titular head, the chief executive. I had colleagues of mine that were going up every 2 weeks or thereabouts during that period to create that sort of relationship base. The second thing we did is we associated with the local brand, and we understood that in the first instance, what was important was not our own brand, but our ability to associate with a highly regarded brand in Japan. We did that for a while. The third is we sold tickets at an eye-watering discount. It was, despite the fact that the sort of cultural rules are different, some other laws of economics remain the same. People do actually care about the value proposition, and they are drawn to lower prices. That was very much to get the market used to our product, our services. And only in the 5 years after that did we start really investing in having our brand be differentiated from the brands we'd associated with. And they were, if you're familiar with Japanese travel, it was JTB, JALPAC, some of the large Japanese wholesalers. We started pulling our brand identity out of that. We started putting rates gradually up. But first, having worked our way into the market in a very slow and methodic way, and being willing, frankly, to take some pretty eye-watering losses for a period of time till we did that. Down the road, there was the Philippines. We flew to the Philippines, Manila in the Philippines. We were in a marketplace where we had a superior product against the local competitor, Philippine Airlines. We had good relationships with the travel trade there. We did very poorly in that market because at the market clearing price, our airplane filled, our competitor's airplane didn't fill. They reduced price, such as the price sensitivity in that market, that it overcame every other consideration. People flooded to their airplane. We matched. They flooded to our airplane. They went lower, and we chased each other into the economic ground. As many successes we had a number of failures as well.
One of the things that's interesting about the difference between policy and rules and culture, at least on the surface, is that rules can be changed. But I imagine over a 30-year career, maybe you've seen culture change as well in some places. Has business culture homogenized around the world? Have you seen the uniqueness of these various places that you've done business with melt away a little bit?
The answer to that would be both yes and no. Yes, insofar as overseas business cultures, I think, are more understanding of the way in which business is done in the United States, which, after all, is the largest market on the planet. And there are certain things that I think people appreciate, the innovations that were developed in this country that are important to them. E-commerce is perhaps the most obvious big example. So in that sense, there's been a tremendous kind of movement to homogenize business practices. But the overlay of culture remains as strong as ever. And in working internationally now, coming from a culture such as this, it's important, in my view, to be constantly aware of those two things. On the one hand, they understand where you're coming from. The bigger question is, do you understand where they're coming from? Too many, I think, American businesses in particular, for the reasons I stated at the outset, become absorbed with, do they understand where we're coming from? And they don't spend enough time thinking about, do we understand where they're coming from?
I can imagine there are some days where you are happy that you're not in your former role.
Yeah, most days.
And maybe the explosion of the coronavirus is one of those settings where you're glad you're not running an airline. How is this going to affect the industry?
Well, tying it back to the question the point I just raised, which is how do we see it and how do they see it? I think what's really important is to really assemble all the pieces of the jigsaw puzzle. So a lot about the coronavirus is relatively unknown, but a lot of it is more likely than not likely. And amongst the more likely than not is that it will have an impact for a finite period of time, that this will not actually change things forever in the same way that SARS didn't change things forever. So having a view, certainly at a strategic level, about whether this fundamentally changes everything or whether it is more a tactical question of if rather than when, I think it is an extremely important point. I will give you another example to show you the importance of asking the market. So again, Hawaiian Airlines serves all of these markets in Asia. Almost everybody sitting on the airplane originate at those points in Asia. I mean, what we're doing, what Hawaiian does, is it sells Hawaii as a destination. Hawaii is about 1.5 million inhabitants. Many of them like to go up to Japan, but they won't fill an airplane every single day. They're probably less than 5% of the onboard traffic is generated in the market. So it's really important to know what happens at the downlink side. We started flying to Japan in December of 2010, from recollection. In March of 2011, they had the Tohoku earthquake and the terrible tsunami that we all saw on TV. Being, fortunately, I think, as a company relatively sensitive to this, I mean, we just started service. Most US airlines pulled their service. Myself and my colleagues, senior colleagues, we went to Japan 4 days later. What was interesting about that was there was a stampede coming the other way as Western businesses were pulling their staff out. You remember there was the supposed concern about radiation from the Fukushima power plants, which are only some 70 miles away from downtown Tokyo. That was not lost on the Japanese, that in a time of grave national emergency, the first reaction of most Western businesses was to withdraw their people, in the airline business, cut service. We went 4 days later. We went and we visited our major suppliers, and we asked them, what do you think this all means? What do you think is going to happen? And how would you like us to behave in the event that we have an opportunity to alter how we behave? And the answer was, there will be 40 days of official mourning, during which time it would be unseemly for people to book vacations. But after that 40-day period, things will return to the previously anticipated level. Recognizing that other US airlines had withdrawn, we actually accelerated new service into Japan, and the first 2 new routes into Japan after the earthquake were with Hawaiian Airlines. The vote of confidence that represented, the sense of we had asked them, they had made a suggestion, and we had responded to that, was perhaps the single most important thing, even after the 10 visits the year before, to help establish a level of sincerity around partnership, which now means that Hawaiian Airlines is the largest airline flying between Hawaii and Japan. And that was about listening to those at the other end of the route.
Well, it relates a little bit to what we learned from Maya Haraki, our teaching assistant today, as we were trying to prepare for class. You know, any company anywhere loves to have what we think of as super loyalists in their consumer base. You know, someone who will always use Crest toothpaste or always buy this brand or that brand. And what I learned is that Hawaiian Airlines has quite a strong super loyalist base. And there must be a trick to that because so many people have so many negative impressions and assessments of so many different airline brands. But as we listened to Maya, she sounded like a super loyalist, but she sounded like she was speaking for many others too. Everything from the music to the cookies to the, I mean, how do you do it?
Well, first of all, thank you, Maya. And I would say unreservedly that it has everything to do with the culture of Hawaii and the community from which we drew our employees. We had the fact that Hawaiian Airlines does indeed have a super loyal consumer base and does really deliver a quality of service unmatched by any U.S. airline is purely a function of the quality of the people we have interacting with the customers at the front line. And those of us in senior management, if we were to bring any sort of attention on ourselves for having achieved this, it's simply largely to get out of the way and to have allowed the cultural elements that are alive and well in Hawaiian society to come to the fore in terms of what we did. So, in Hawaiian culture, the notion of hospitality is very important, and hospitality is most often, and almost every single social case, driven by providing food. You really cannot go into somebody's home without being fed, and it is well known that if you come from the mainland and you settle in Hawaii as an executive, it's a sort of 10 to 15 pound problem within a relatively short period of time. It was therefore important to us to make sure that our frontline team had the tools to deliver the sort of hospitality that was innate within the culture of Hawaii. So even at a time when every single U.S. airline was taking food off the airplane, we continued to provide food. And it was unjustifiable on a spreadsheet. There is no math that allowed, that justified providing food. You know, $25 million worth of food did not equate to $25 million of revenue. But what it did was it gave our frontline employees, I'm using one example, the tools with which they could express their natural sort of cultural desire to deliver hospitality to guests on board that helped unlock a range of other benefits that flowed.
That's another question as we think about the picture of the map of the world. So Hawaiian Airlines, you're in Honolulu, I assume, the headquarters. And there are all kinds of activities, back office activities that any corporation will have to support, right? Seems like it's easier to do that in a place like Chicago than it would be Honolulu. Did you have the resources, the partner companies, the skill sets within Hawaii to support the company, or did you have to go offshore? And if you went offshore, how did that work?
So if you look across the spectrum of disciplines involved in running an airline, some of those we had in the islands, some of them we had onshore, if you like, we actually call it mainland, in the United States, and some of them we actually had overseas in India and in the Philippines. And it was not one size fits all. As you look across, running an airline, what you try and say is it's actually really hard to differentiate your product in the airline business because we all fly, broadly speaking, the same kind of airplanes. We all have the same kind of seats in the airplanes. The vast majority of customers sit in the economy cabin. People rarely differentiate between one economy seat and another. We fly from the same crappy airports to the same crappy airports. We're subject to the same awful ATC delays as everybody else. So this, we're all tightly regulated. So the scope for differentiation is not enormous. The question for an airline management is to decide, given that very narrow capacity for differentiation, where are we going to put our chips, and where are we actually going to try and save? Because it's a very competitive business. You can't afford to be the best, the highest spec product across the spectrum of every single touch point. You've got to decide what your company cares about more than others. That sort of informed us in terms of some of the decisions we made. So we had all of our ground staff in the Hawaiian Islands were Hawaiian Airlines employees. What we call above the wing on the US mainland were all Hawaiian Airlines employees, most of whom have some Hawaii connection, often part of the Hawaiian diaspora on the mainland. That was a very important touch point. We actually decided to outsource our IT activities from Hawaii to India. And the interesting thing about that, when I've had to describe it to people, is people assume that that was a cost-saving activity. And the costs were at the margin lower. But in reality, it was a capability leveling decision. Hawaii, as I mentioned to you, is 1.5 million people. It has a strong sense of community. There are a lot of people from Hawaii who, for family reasons and out of preference, will never move from the state. If you look at our business, we had 200 different IT applications across the business. We found that we could staff some of those areas with a quality of individual way above what we would be able to do on the US mainland. They were working, for example, with an expertise, let's say in SAP or Oracle, they were working at a higher capability than we necessarily needed, but we were kind of the only game in town in the islands. If they want to stay in the island, this job they're going to have. Right next to them would be another application where the problem is we couldn't find fully qualified individual. Because if you've only got 1.5 million inhabitants, it's an illiquid job market. And you have, in a number of skills areas, very uneven distribution, not lower. And there's a great narrative sometimes in Hawaii that it's lower, and it isn't. It absolutely isn't. The same distribution of capable people and not so capable people, smart people, not so smart people. The issue is that once the market for talent gets tight, then if you've got so many activities for which you need to attain a certain level, it becomes very difficult to do that in a small labor market. You go to India, by contrast, and you have enormous human resources available to you, almost limitless human resources. And so what you trade is an uneven distribution of human resources in an area like IT for an even one. And that, when you're trying to run a business, is sometimes so compelling that even if there are no cost savings involved, that's an important thing to do.
So, Mark, I want to give our students a chance to ask some questions, but I have just one final one. Do you have a summary kind of advice you tend to give undergraduate students as they think about the future?
Well, absolutely. I'm a product of living and working in different cultures. I've, as you pointed out, Pietro, worked in one industry. Not many people do that. The thing that has added dimension and interest to my life more broadly than getting up in the morning and going to work and coming home in the evenings has been the opportunity in my life to live and work and manage in different cultures around the world. And frankly, that's an enormous privilege. It was not that many generations ago where that was not possible. The number of, even the very wealthiest people on the planet hadn't traveled. And in my life, that has been a source of enormous fulfillment and joy. And certainly, as I was so excited to hear about the new degree program and the way that you're bringing these things together, I would certainly encourage people, all of you, as you look to make your way in the world, is to think about taking the opportunity to live and work and participate as a sort of cliche-ridden but global citizen, as opposed to settling in one place. It's a privilege that is available to your generation, was available to my generation, and it's something I think everybody should embrace.
Mark, thank you so much.